Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Change on the Run podcast, where we discuss common change challenges and ways you can address them when you're short of time. And I'm your host, Phil Buckley. Today's topic is measuring readiness for change. The biggest question to answer before people take on a change is, are they prepared to do so? And it's essential to confirm that they have the required skills and knowledge for each phase of preparation, because learning is cumulative. The preparation for one phase leads to the next, which really leads to people having everything they need to go live and take it on. So how do you know that people have the knowledge and the skills required to take on change? And my guest today is Bob Kaufman. Bob, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Phil.
Thanks, Bob. So excited that you're on with us. Looking at your career, and I know we've known each other for years, it's so impressive. Bob has been leading change management initiatives for over 20 years. After graduating from the Wharton School of Business, he spent 11 years at Accenture, including helping the development of the first change management methodology. And for most of his career, Bob has been an external change management consultant working across 10 different industries. Currently, Bob is a change leader at McCormick & Company, a global leader in flavor, seasonings, and spices. And Bob lives in the US in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And Bob, I know you're passionate about ensuring change achieves the intended business results. What's been your experience with measuring readiness for change?
So before talking about my experience, I just want to talk for a minute about why we measure readiness for change. Firstly, early on, it provides evidence for the degree of change management effort that's going to be required. And also it informs the change planning. And then later on, measuring readiness for change, it provides a mechanism to help ensure that people are prepared for change. So these are a couple of key reasons why we measure readiness for change, early on, throughout the project, and at the end of the project. Very important. So my experience, I've been thinking about my experience about measuring change. And fortunately, I've had a lot of positive experiences, and I want to share a couple of those. And I also want to share a not so positive experience that I learned from and other people learned from. And before I do that, three key concepts to get across. First is that measuring change, it's a partnership between the business and the change management team. Because as we know, the business is ultimately accountable for project success, and that includes measuring readiness for change. So the change management team is an enabling function that facilitates and partners with the business in the measuring of readiness work stream. Second key concept, it's important to measure readiness for change at key milestones throughout the project lifecycle, rather than just measuring readiness for go live. So a couple of examples there are, you want to measure, are people ready to begin the design work? Another example, are people ready to begin their detailed training? So that key concept, measure ready, identify key milestones that you want to make sure people are ready for, and then measure readiness in preparation for each of those key milestones. And the final key concept I think is important is you want to measure achievement of objectives rather than measuring completion of activities. So taking training as an example, I'm much more interested to know that what percentage of end users pass their training course assessments, rather than knowing the percentage of end users who attended training. Attending training is an activity, but did they really learn something? So you want to measure achievement of objectives rather than completion of an activity.
It actually raises a couple of questions from me. And the first one is on the first concept of it is a partnership. I've experienced sort of the business sometimes do not see that it is a partnership and is looking at the project team as the ones that are doing the preparation. Have you had that experience as well?
Yeah, so I've had a couple of examples early on where the business sponsor, the business leadership, had this perception that it was the project team that was really on the hook for success. And in my early on discussions, I asked a few key questions of the business sponsor. And one is, if this project is a success, what are the positive consequences to you as the leader and to the company? Conversely, if this project is a failure, what are the consequences to you in your role and to the company? And through that discussion of consequences of success or failure, that led to the discussion of, well, really, who's responsible for success? And I often use the phrase, the managers of the business are responsible for running the business. And that includes running business as usual and improving business as usual. And projects are an example of improving business as usual. So it's really the management of the organization that's ultimately accountable for project success.
No, well said. And I would imagine doing that up front, then everyone's on the same page versus trying to make that agreement halfway through the initiative.
That's right. If you don't have that intentional discussion up front with the leaders, the business sponsors, they have assumptions and you have assumptions. And sure enough, those assumptions may not be aligned midway through the project.
And I'm just wondering that the third point about, measuring the objectives versus the activities, which I think is brilliant. Sometimes I've seen, projects in play and where the measurements or the validations are, the activities, not the actual objectives. Have you experienced that when you've come in and you see, oh my goodness, people are celebrating 80% attending training sessions versus what they actually learned from those sessions?
Yeah, I have experience of that. I've been parachuted in on some troubled projects. And in one of those projects, they were measuring on the communication side, the project was measuring, was this email distributed, about the project? And that's an activity. They were measuring activity, the completion of activities. And so after probing and asking some questions, we all agreed it would be much better to understand what are we trying to achieve with communications. And as an example, it's really important that employees perceive that their immediate supervisor, supports the program or supports the change, as well as the perception of employees that senior management are committed to the change. And so it's probing and asking employees these kinds of questions and getting the employee perception that's much more important than did they get the email from their supervisor or from senior management.
Makes perfect sense. So please, share some stories. I'd love to hear about, when it has gone well, when it hasn't gone well, and sort of the learning that you've taken from that over the years.
Sure. I'll share an experience where it went well. The project was a government project. It was, in fact, the government of Washington, D.C., my hometown. And about 6 months before go live, I was harboring this feeling that we were very activity focused, that we were on the weekly status meetings, project status meetings. People were talking about completion of activities, and everyone was focused on tasks and activities rather than achieving objectives. And so I approached the head of the PMO and the project sponsor and got them to agree to engage in a readiness activity, to stand up a measuring readiness for change process that was much bigger than just change management. In fact, all project work streams participated. And I facilitated the development of the categories of readiness, and for each category, what were those readiness criteria, and then eventually, what are the measures, readiness measures for each criteria. And we had weekly meetings for the 4 months before go live that covered the key milestones, readiness for training, readiness for cutover, readiness for go live. And we had the leads of each work stream on the project in a weekly meeting going through this readiness checklist. And the checklist, because I was facilitating, I made sure that we were measuring objectives, achievement of objectives, not just completion of tasks.
Excellent. And did you find that the participation was good over time, given it was a 4-month period where people actually did show up and go through your facilitation?
Yes, it was successful for a couple of reasons, the most important of which is that the project sponsor and the head of the PMO, who everyone looked up to, right? They were the ones who were inviting people to the meeting, ensuring people attended, and if people didn't attend, they would be the ones to follow up with, why did you not attend last week's meeting? So even though I was behind the scenes facilitating, it was the sponsorship from the head of the PMO and the project sponsor that drove the process.
And did that involve coaching of yourself? Because it sounds like a sort of that dream sequence of the ideal sponsor where she or he, follows up and says, this is an important task that we need to do. If you weren't there, what's your reason? And if it's not a good reason, I expect you there next week.
As part of the initial discussions with the project sponsor and the head of the PMO, and it was a 3-way conversation. I didn't have one conversation with the sponsor and a separate conversation with the head of the PMO. In those 3-way conversations, I made it very clear that one of the benefits of having everyone in attendance, all the leaders of the work streams in attendance, was because of all the interdependencies across the work streams. And that if one of the work streams was not represented, that would dilute the value of the conversations. And because the sponsor and the head of the PMO understood this value of having every work stream represented, they were all over making sure attendance was good.
Excellent. I think there's a theme in our conversation here from your experience is that, constantly linking good practice to the business results the organization is trying to achieve. In this case, the government, that the best defense is to either talk about the risk of not receiving the benefits, or the golden city of, in order for us to be successful, you have to do these things.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Great. And what happened at the end? Were people ready to go live, after, sort of there's 3 days to go? You've done this for 4 months and the go live is approaching. What was your experience there, given the amount of work everyone had put into making sure people were prepared?
Well, that was an interesting project because a couple of months before the go live, there was the realization that the system, so there was going to be system changes, policy changes, process changes, that the system was not going to be ready at the go live date, but the go live date could not change. And therefore, 2 months before go live, this realization that we had to come up with a workaround set of procedures to go live with kicked off a replanning effort that I facilitated. And then we came up with a new set of readiness measures around the workarounds, and we were able to go live, and the Washington, D.C. government employees were able to provide service to the citizens of D.C. In a seamless manner, even though we had that hiccup around the system.
That's incredible, because a lot of the government work that I've read about, or a few that I've done, where there are more of the horror stories where the client, which is the citizen, isn't getting the service, or it breaks down and they're not able to get the services that they require. It's incredible to hear that through this experience, even with a workaround, they were able to get what they needed.
That's right. It was very gratifying. And there were very long hours involved because with 2 months to go, you have to redesign, the workarounds and all of that. So yeah, but it was very, very satisfying.
Wow. Do you have another story where maybe things haven't gone as well, whether it's, through your experience or even just hearing about it with your colleagues of, this is what you shouldn't do if you really truly want people to be prepared?
Sure. There's a story that comes right to the top of my mind, Phil. And it was a manufacturer. And I was brought into the project, not at the beginning, but, towards the middle. And I sensed immediately that it was an activity-focused project, not an objective-focused, approach to work. And in fact, in the middle of the project, there was no thought given to measuring readiness for change. And what happened was, I guess fortunately, but the project was paused a few months before the go live, and a subsequent lessons learned activity revealed that some key contributors to readiness were not going to be in place. So, for example, middle management, they were not supportive of the change. And we didn't know that because we were not measuring readiness for change, and management support for the change is a key contributor that you want to measure. Another example is that the employees did not understand the changes to ways of working prior to their attending the detailed training classes. So they didn't get that education about what's changing. So when they were going to go on their training classes and learn the new processes and the systems and the new policies, they wouldn't have the context to learn. And they needed that scaffolding that comes with understanding the key changes to ways of working. So this subsequent lessons learned activity revealed some key contributors were missing around readiness for change.
It sounds like a disaster waiting to occur given the lack of direction for them and the context especially. What were some of the observable sort of signals that there wasn't support from the managers, people didn't have the context for the learning they were about to receive?
So in the lessons learned activity, we reached out, the change management team reached out to the business and got that data through surveys and focus groups. And so that's where the data came from, by actually engaging the middle managers and the perception of their frontline staff around manager commitment.
And was it sort of emotional comments, or was it sort of rational, hey, we don't support it? Or sometimes I think we find that people, when they don't support, they're angry, they're concerned, they're feeling left out of the whole process.
Yes, there was some emotion absolutely as part of that. And also the employees and the managers felt that they were not sufficiently engaged in the process, which was a major contributor to a lack of commitment. Yeah.
Right. And so what did you do? Like, you've got the lessons learned, it's clear, at least from your perspective, what's going on. What did you do next?
Well, in that case, I was an external consultant. And so I was assigned to another client, another project. And so I didn't participate in the future. The reason why the project was paused was there was a change in strategy. So the company had a strategy in place and initiated this big project. And halfway through the project, they changed their corporate strategy, which that's right. Everyone realized that this project was heading now in the wrong direction, the company in the wrong direction. That's right.
And did you hear anything sort of afterward, that the lessons learned were actually, adopted? Because sometimes, companies, or organizations can go, great, we've learned, we'll do things differently in the future. And other times the lessons learned get presented and buried, and, the natural culture of the organization takes over, and it's a repeat of past sort of challenges.
Yeah, so I did hear via the grapevine, because I was not associated, after the pause. I did hear that the company was split up into 3 separate companies. That was the change in strategy. And one of the 3 companies that was spun off ended up restarting the project and moving forward and were successful. And the other 2 pieces of the company that were split off decided not to continue with the project.
Right.
But that one part of the company did relaunch the project and carried that message through. That's right.
Any thoughts about when you do get lessons learned, or even if it's in a project where there is that pause, as you say, and it's a reevaluation, to really make sure that the lessons learned sort of are embedded into the thinking of how to run projects, versus, again, the danger of the presentation and it's on a SharePoint site, or it's in a document that's never sort of looked at again.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of ongoing lessons learned, rather than going through an entire life cycle of a project and at the very end, asking the questions, what could we have done better? What did we do well? Rather, build it into a monthly or even weekly process sometimes. When you have your status meeting, one topic is, what did we learn this week? And what will we do differently because of that learning? If you build that into the process, the status review meetings or a monthly program review, if you build in lessons learned throughout the entire project life cycle, you're much better off.
I think that's tremendous. And it's so rare when that happens, but, and perhaps it even builds a capability or a skill of learning lessons learned and adopting them. And it's just expected that we'll be looking for them and we'll be incorporating them.
That's right. It also flexes our collective self-awareness muscle, that by incorporating lessons learned into a regular ongoing process, it encourages all of us on the project team, from the business side and the project team side, to be more reflective and self-aware. It really helps flex that muscle.
And have you ever found that with some clients or other organizations, you've actually been part of the internal team, that there is a culture where if something doesn't go as well as planned, it's not celebrated and brought in, but it's almost seen as a knock on the team, or it's something that will show up in a performance review, but the culture doesn't support sharing your lessons learned because it's seen as poor performance?
That's a great question, Phil. Some of my clients, when I was an external consultant, celebrated lessons learned and self-reflection and improvement, and other clients had a different culture which did not support a lessons learned kind of approach. Very early on in my career, I was working in the oil industry, and on a particular project, I tried to institute this lessons learned approach, and it was not met very favorably by senior leadership.
And it's challenging, and sometimes I imagine it's a yes, but no, we don't do it that way, or even, hey, that sounds great, you try it and it doesn't work, because people are more in tuned into the real culture than you would be coming in as an external.
That's right.
And Bob, I'm wondering, given all your knowledge, if you came in and it was sort of the one thing you could do, whether you're short of time or you're coming in and setting up a really good measurement process for preparedness, what's the one thing you would do that would lead to a successful outcome of measuring true preparedness versus activities? If there's one thing that you'd say, that's what I do, what would that be?
I would go back to an earlier comment I made around measuring readiness for key milestones. By that, I mean, let's be really clear. People need to be ready, yes, for go live, but before go live, they need to be ready to begin their detailed training. And before that, the project needs to be ready to initiate design work. And so if we're really clear on those key milestones, and for each milestone, what has to be in place, that's where the readiness measure should be, rather than some general, are we ready for change in society? Let's be really clear on the milestone that we're measuring readiness for change about. It's that clarity around milestones and then you work backwards. Okay, before an employee begins their training program, they need to understand the changes to ways of working. They need to perceive that their manager is really supportive of the change. So there are several contributors to readiness for training that need to be in place, and let's clarify those. And then if you're short on time, then what you want to do is focus your efforts on making sure that those contributors to readiness are in place.
Your comment about setting milestone criteria up front is essential, I think, because sometimes almost all times, the pressure to pass readiness tests is greater than conducting the true assessment. And in these cases, any positive indication that people are ready can be enough for leaders to say, let's move on, because the consequences of holding back can be too great. And it can almost be like anything from holding your hand up in the air to test the wind, or to get a couple of comments from people saying they feel ready. It's not enough. It's a recipe for disaster, but it happens all the time.
If we take that readiness for training example, if I perceive that my manager isn't supportive of the change, I may not even attend the training. And if I do attend the training, I may not be really motivated to learn as much as possible. On the other hand, if I perceive my manager really supports this project, I am going to attend the training and I will put my best effort forward to learn.
Very true. And it reminds me of a quick thought, and you might have seen this as well, where a leader will say, yes, this training is absolutely essential, but unfortunately I'm too busy to attend myself. So I wish you all the best, because it's not important enough for me to attend, but I'm giving you the party line that says that you should attend. And at least from my experience, people know what that means, and they're less engaged and perhaps less keen on learning.
Amen.
If I could only do one thing to set up a readiness assessment for success, I'd include the leaders in the validation process. So I would give them simple questions for them to ask their team members. And based on those responses, the leader would say whether the team was ready to move on to the next level of preparation or whether they needed more support. And I think there's a couple of benefits in doing that. The first one is that sort of field or business data is always perceived as more credible than the project teams. And the second would be that it gives another opportunity for the leader to engage in the change process, so that their focus, their intent on where they're at right now in the different steps of leading to go live, and also they're having a voice in how things are going. Bob, have you seen that, or have you actually done that yourself?
I have. I've taken a limited data set and asked the sponsors to ask their teams just a few key questions. And I've complemented that with the bottoms up, reaching out to the frontline staff and asking them about their perceptions. And then we marry up the top down data collected by the sponsor with the bottom up data that we've collected from the frontline staff and the middle managers, and then had a discussion with the sponsors. That not only gives you better information than if you just went bottom up, but it also tips the scales in terms of sponsor commitment. It really encourages the sponsors because they have more skin in the game.
So true. And just closing off, Bob, I just wonder, again, all of the sort of readiness work that you've done, if there's one kind of tip or watch out or insight you'd like to share with listeners, what would that be?
Gee, there's so many things, but I think it goes back to the partnership. If the business sponsor and the project management, the head of the PMO, head of the project, if they believe that it's change management's responsibility, the change management team's responsibility for achieving change management success, that's a bad recipe. So it's that partnership, agreeing upfront with the head of the project and also the project sponsor that it's a partnership between the change management team that facilitates the process, but ultimately the business is accountable for change management and project success. If you can get that agreement up front, and also it's not just an agreement, but you're agreeing to ways of working. How are you going to partner? What is that cadence, that weekly, monthly cadence, right? So that that partnership comes to life and gets executed. So that one insight of agreeing partnership, and then once that agreement is there, what are the ways of working between the change management team, the project manager, and the sponsor? How are those three groups going to work together to achieve success?
Well said. Thank you. And doing it up front, as you said, throughout our conversation is so important, kicking off in the right way versus trying to do it halfway through when things aren't going as well. It just shows, the experience you've had, that setting up yourself for success, some say is half the battle, but it's definitely a large piece of it.
I would agree with that.
Oh, that's great. Well, Bob, thank you so much for being on the Change on the Run podcast. It's been so great to talk with you as always and to get your experience. Thanks for being on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Phil.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks, Bob. And I'd also like to thank our producer, Charlie Buckley. And thanks to you, the listener. And if you have any questions or comments, please email me at phil@changewithconfidence.com. And for upcoming episodes, if you're interested, please subscribe to the podcast. Until the next time, I wish you all the best as we continue to lead change.